Hi guys, it's Mr. Gonzalez again, here with Lesson 12, Dotted Half Notes. The main objective of this lesson is to be able to identify dotted half notes and understand how they work in 3/4 time and 4/4 time. Let's get started. A dot after a note increases the duration by half the original value. In 3/4 time and 4/4 time, a half note receives 2 beats. Because a dot following a half note increases the duration by 1 beat, a dotted half note has a value of 3 beats. Let's take a look at this example in 3/4 time. So first, we see our half note. Our half note takes up these first 2 beats, and then to finish out the measure, we need 1 extra beat from this quarter note. But when we add the dot, since half of 2 is 1, and the dot adds half of the original value, we now have 3 whole beats. Here's another way to look at it. We have 3 quarter notes occupying this measure, so we have 3 beats in this measure. And then with our dotted half note, we only need this one note because it occupies all 3 beats. Let's take a look at our 4/4 measures. So in our first measure, we see 2 quarter notes and 1 half note occupying all 4 beats of this measure. But when we have the dotted half note, it takes up the first 3 beats. And to complete the measure, we can either add a quarter note or a quarter rest. But in this case, we added a quarter note to give us that 1 extra beat. Here, we also see a similar example. Our first beat is occupied by a quarter note, and to finish out the last 3 beats, we have a dotted half note. And then just another duration of time that we can have here is 2 half notes. Remember, without a dot, it's just 2 beats, but when it's with a dot, 3 beats. Let's take a look at our examples. In our first example, we are going to complete the measure using 1 note or 1 rest. If you look up on top of each measure, I have indicated what we need to use. Let's get started. Our first example is in 4/4 time. In the first measure, we see a dotted half note. We just learned about this, that the dotted half note takes up 3 full beats. So beat 1, 2, and 3 are occupied. On top it says we need a rest. So we need a rest that equals 1 beat. We can use our quarter rest. In our second measure, we see a half note. A half note by itself occupies 2 beats. So beat 1 and 2 are occupied. We need a rest that equals 2 beats. We can use our half rest. For the third measure, we see a dotted half note on beats 2, 3, and 4, so we need 1 note that occupies 1 beat. We can use our quarter note. Our next measure has a half note on beat 3 and 4. We're looking here, it says we need 1 note, and we need 1 note to occupy 2 beats. We can use another half note. In our second to last measure, we see 2 quarter notes occupying beat 1 and 2. We have 2 open beats and we need a rest. Let's use our half rest. And then for our last measure, we see a quarter note on beat 1 and a half note on beat 3 and 4. We need 1 note to fill in the space in beat 2. We can use a quarter note. For our second example, again, we are going to complete the measure using 1 note or rest. Again, above each measure, I have written whether we are going to use a rest or a note. Let's get started. For this example, we are in 3/4 time. Remember, we only have 3 beats per measure this time. So, in our first measure, we see a half note occupying beats 1 and 2. We need 1 rest to occupy the last beat. Since it's only 1 beat, we can use our quarter rest. In our next measure, we see a half note on beat 2 and 3. Beat 1 is open, and we need a note to complete this measure. Well, right now, we only have 1 note that occupies 1 beat, and that's our quarter note. For our next measure, we see it empty. and we see 3 blank beats. We need 1 rest. Remember, when we're trying to show a full measure of rest in 3/4 time, we can use our whole note. For our next measure, we see a blank measure, and we need a rest. So we have 3 beats to fill. Remember, when you are in 3/4 time, you can use a whole rest to show a complete measure of rest. And for our last measure, we see a dotted half note. Remember, a dotted half note occupies 3 beats. So this measure is complete and we do not need to add anything else. For our next example, I have already drawn the grand staff for us, as well as a double bar line at the end. For this example, we need to add stems to the note heads and bar lines to the staff. Let's get going. First things first, let's add our stems. Looking at these blacked in note heads, we already know that they are quarter notes. Let's add our stems. Just a quick reminder about stem direction. If the notes are below the 3rd line, the stems go facing up on the right, and if the notes are on the 3rd line or above, the stems go facing down on the left. Let's take a look at our last 3 notes. Okay? They all have open note heads, but these 2 have dots. Since we just learned about dotted half notes, it is safe to assume that these 2 are dotted half notes and can have stems. Now the last note in question is here. This can either be a half note or a whole note, but let's wait to find out. Right now, let's just add our stems to these 2 notes. Everything looks good so far. We're still going to hold off on judging this note. Right now, let's focus on adding some bar lines. Okay, let's take a look at this treble clef side here. We have 3 beats from this dotted half note and 1 beat from this quarter rest. We also see a whole note, so we have 4 beats of rest here. Since we are in 4/4 time, we can assume that this is 1 full measure. So we'll add our bar line right there. Everything checks out on this side. Let's look for 4 more beats. In our next measure, we see 4 quarter notes. Alright, that's 4 beats. Then we see a whole rest, 4 more beats. So we can add a bar line right here. Alright, things check out again. In our next area, we see a half rest, so we have 2 beats. Then we see a quarter rest, so now we have 3 beats total, and then a quarter note, so 4 beats. And then at the bottom, we see a whole rest, so 4 more beats. We can add a bar line right here. It's our moment of truth for this guy. Before we take a peek at him, let's look at the bottom. So down here we have a dotted half note, so 3 beats, plus a quarter note, 1 beat. So we have 4 beats here. But looking at this side, we can assume this all stays together, so this belongs here. We can deduce that this is not a half note, but in fact a whole note, because we need 4 beats to fill out this top measure. We can add our bar line right here. Perfection. This all looks great. And then that finishes up our last measure. We have a whole rest at the bottom, and then 1 quarter note, 1 quarter rest, 1 quarter note, and then another quarter rest, all adding up to 4 beats in each measure. Great job. And that's it for today's lesson, guys. I hope you feel more confident in your ability to identify dotted half notes and understand their roles in both 3/4 time and 4/4 time. In our next lesson, we will be looking at ties and slurs.